I'm Norm Poltenson, the publisher of the Business Journal. I'd like to share a few thoughts with you during what I call the silly season. This is the period at the end of the conventions when we know who the Republican and Democratic nominees will be, and we go into the final sprint to the election, and we hear a lot of things on the economic side, since that's our main focus in this campaign, is recovery from our economic doldrums. So let me talk to you about three myths that come to mind. And these are tied to what my Keynesian friends would call the basic philosophy of Keynes, which is the fact that government would spend money and thus put money in the pockets of consumers who will drive up demand, and that makes the economy recover or grow or whatever it needs to do. So let's take a look at a couple of myths, actually three myths. And the first one is one that I first learned back in college in the 1950s when Paul Samuelson wrote his book on economics, which everybody used. And they said because the government spent so much money during World War II on war production, that's what drove us out of the Depression and into the economic boom that followed the war. That has been accepted as gospel ever since. And yet when you go back and you look at industrial production during the period 1941 to 45, which is the period of World War II, what we find is industrial production went up 26% overall. And that's a huge increase. But if you look back to the 1920s, during a 4 or 5 year period, you find that production went up twice as much with no government investing whatsoever. Samuelson also touted the fact that, of course, unemployment came down, but doesn't mention the fact that 12 million Americans were conscripted into the armed services, which would suggest that the rate of unemployment would fall substantially if you took that many people out of the employment lines. And then if you break out non-military gross national product during that period of the Second World War, we actually had a recovery that was well underway in 1940 and 41 during the war. When we switched over to wartime production, the non-military gross national production went down substantially for several years. So believing that World War II and spending during World War II brought us out of the Depression, I think falls into the category of myth. The second part has to do with the Keynesian idea of demand. And there we are told that as soon as the war ended, all this pent-up demand by consumers meant that they rushed out to buy products, and therefore the economy grew. It's also based on the myth that the wartime production was a 100% mobilization effort on the part of Americans. Wrong. We actually converted 40% of our capacity, our industrial capacity, into military production, which meant 60% was still producing consumer items. And you're talking to somebody who remembers the ration books during World War II, when yes, it was tough to buy gasoline and rubber tires and tough to buy meat, but there were plenty of other items that consumers could buy. Secondly, if this demand, this pent-up demand suddenly was released, the dam was released, and we were spending money like crazy, why is it that the savings rate went up after the war for a year and a half and went up by 11.6%? And I think the reason is because consumers assumed that as soon as the war ended, we were going right back into a recession or depression, and they tucked their money away. Now, there's another thing that the book, Samuelson's book, didn't mention on economics, and that's the fact that even before the war ended in 1945, Congress cut personal and corporate income taxes. And as soon as the war ended, they got rid of price and wage controls. Those tax cuts and the fact that the economy was open meant that business could really invest. And between 1945 and 1948, the amount of capital investment went up by a factor of 4, a tremendous investment push. We didn't call it supply-side economics in those days. It was just investment. But that's actually what happened. Now, there's a third myth I'd like to deal with that we hear every week, and that is that during the Clinton years, we had an economic boom with higher taxes. It didn't make any difference. Well, let's put that one in perspective. Number one, when President Clinton came into office, the Cold War had ended just a couple years before. The Berlin Wall was torn down, and suddenly the global economy was on a tear. Secondly, can you remember oil prices at under $11 a barrel when he came in? And during his whole administration, it averaged $20 a barrel. And thirdly, inflation never got above 2% during that entire period. So President Clinton walked into a confluence of events that meant probably anybody could have done a great job on the economy. So how good was the job? Well, we grew on average 3.3% during his first term. That's after he raised taxes in a number of areas. We still grew 3.3%. I think the economists would call that respectable. Not great, but respectable. Republicans came in 94. Taxes went down. Clinton made his pivot to the center in 96 for re-election, and we had a substantial tax cut. What happened in the second term? Growth went up from 3.3 to 4.4%, and real wages went up 1.7% per year. These are just some of the myths that you hear. These are just 3 of them that I picked. So as you think about policy, economic policy, and you think about the elections coming up in the next few weeks, think about what is fact and what's reality, and think about what's mythology. I'm Norm Poltenson. Thanks for listening.